Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
They say time heals all wounds, but whoever came up with that line never sat alone at a kitchen table holding a cream-colored wedding invitation addressed in handwriting that clearly wasn't written with warmth. I stared at it for what felt like hours, the glossy gold foil catching the light like it was mocking me, as if even the paper knew I didn't belong anymore. Claire and Mark cordially invite you. I stopped reading. My name wasn't on the envelope. It was addressed to Major Rachel Monroe, not sister, not even Rachel, just my rank. Like I was being summoned to an obligation, not a celebration. It felt like a slap disguised in etiquette. I hadn't spoken to Claire in almost 2 years. Not since the day everything about my life fell apart in the public eye. When I went from being a decorated army officer to a headline in a scandal, no one bothered to understand. I still remember the headline. Hero turned whistleblower exposes military corruption, but at what cost? That question, at what cost, haunted every conversation afterward. Job interviews, therapist sessions, even awkward small talk at the grocery store. And it sure as hell haunted my family. Claire had always been about appearances. Growing up, she was the girl who smiled through gritted teeth, who practiced her laugh in the mirror, who ironed her bed sheets even though no one saw them. She was 5 years younger, and somehow always older in the eyes of our mother. Claire didn't rebel. Claire didn't make noise. Claire blended in, married well, got her face in a few local magazines, and built a brand around being the graceful one. And me? I was the one who came home from Iraq with shrapnel in my thigh, stories I couldn't tell, and a stubborn tendency to speak up when something was wrong, even when it cost me everything. When I got the invitation, I poured myself a drink. I hadn't touched whiskey in months, but something about that envelope cracked open a vault of old pain that needed numbing. I told myself I wasn't going. I didn't owe her anything. Hell, I'd seen more compassion from strangers in D.C. than I ever got from Claire when my name was being dragged through the mud. But 2 drinks in, staring at the invitation, I realized something. I didn't want closure. I wanted confrontation. So I RSVP'd yes, and I booked the flight. The first time I saw Claire in person after everything, it was at the rehearsal dinner, held at one of those overpriced vineyard venues that smell like rose water and entitlement. She saw me before I saw her. I caught the look, frozen for half a second, lips pressed tight, and then the practiced warmth kicked in. "Rachel," she said, walking over in heels that probably cost more than my flight. "You look strong." I almost laughed. Strong was her polite way of saying I looked like someone who didn't belong in her curated little world. I was wearing a black blazer, clean lines, polished boots. No medals, no insignia, just me. She leaned in for a quick hug, and I let her, though my arms didn't move. Her perfume smelled like lilac and tension. "Thanks for coming," she said, smiling, but only with her mouth. Her eyes were already scanning the room behind me. "I wasn't sure I'd be welcome," I replied. My voice was even, low. I wanted her to hear it clearly. She tilted her head slightly, as if feigning confusion. "Why wouldn't you be?" And there it was, the gaslight, the unspoken contract that I was supposed to pretend everything was fine, that my public disgrace hadn't been dissected by morning talk shows while she silently watched from her sanitized distance. No texts, no calls, just silence. The rehearsal itself was uneventful, aside from the small detail that they had me seated in the 3rd row, not with family, not near our mother, not near the groom's parents. 3rd row, like a coworker, like a distant acquaintance they didn't know what to do with. I said nothing. I just watched and listened and took mental notes, like I used to in intelligence briefings, because I knew, even then, I wouldn't be leaving quietly. Afterward, we gathered in the courtyard for wine and finger food, where Claire floated from group to group like a pageant queen, laughing just loud enough to be heard, and holding her glass in a way that looked candid but was clearly rehearsed. At one point, she passed by me with her bridesmaids and made a remark that stopped my breath mid-sip. "Make sure we remind Rachel tomorrow," she said, just loud enough for me to hear. White doesn't suit people who make headlines for the wrong reasons. There it was, not a dagger, but a scalpel. Precise, subtle, public. I set my glass down carefully, almost ceremonially, and turned my head toward her. She didn't meet my eyes. Her friends giggled. One of them fake gasped. I looked at Claire, really looked at her, in her designer dress and flawless makeup, and I realized something that chilled me more than the drink in my hand. She hadn't invited me for closure. She invited me to humiliate me, to make a statement, to put the black sheep on display one last time, safely leashed in her carefully controlled world. But she made one mistake. She gave me a stage. Tell me something. Have you ever been in a moment where someone tried to shame you into silence and instead gave you a spotlight? Because from that moment on, I knew exactly what I was going to wear to her wedding, and I knew she'd never forget it. The morning of the wedding began not with excitement or nerves, but with the sharp, metallic taste of resolve, coating the back of my throat. A kind of clarity that arrives only after someone has insulted you in a room full of people who think your silence is consent. I stood in front of the mirror in the small, impersonal hotel room Claire had generously arranged for me, and stared at the white dress I'd brought out of courtesy, the one I'd originally planned to wear before her little quip about headlines and who deserved the color of purity. It hung on the door like a reminder of the box I was expected to fit in, safe, quiet, respectable, invisible, and for a long moment I considered burning it just for the symbolism. But instead, I folded it neatly and put it back into my suitcase, then unzipped the second garment bag I had brought with me, the one she didn't know existed, the one I hadn't touched in over a year. Inside was my formal army dress uniform, tailored and crisp, adorned with every ribbon, bar, and medal I had earned during nearly 20 years of service. The silver oak leaf insignia glinted slightly in the morning light filtering through the thin curtains, a quiet echo of everything I had fought for, everything I had survived, and everything I had lost, both overseas and back home, when speaking the truth turned into an act of war against my own institution. That uniform was more than fabric and brass. It was identity, legacy, and today it would be defiance. It was a silent scream wrapped in decorum, a polite middle finger wrapped in protocol. The call came as I was tightening the last button across my chest. Claire's voice, artificially light and overly chirpy, came through the phone as though she were hosting a damn lifestyle segment. "Hey Rach, just checking in before the ceremony. The bridal suite's a little crazy right now, but I wanted to remind you about the dress code, just in case. Whites and creams are reserved for the bridal party. You brought that dove gray dress, right?" I didn't respond right away, letting the silence hang long enough to become a presence. Then I said very calmly, "I changed my mind, thought I'd wear something with a bit more history." She hesitated, and I could feel her composure crack through the phone line. "Rachel, this is my wedding day. I just really need everything to be on theme. You understand, right?" "I do," I said, and hung up before she could speak again. The drive to the vineyard was quiet, the sound of the tires on gravel the only real noise breaking the stillness. As I stepped out of the car, the valet's eyebrows lifted for just a second before he schooled his face into neutrality and opened the door for me. My boots hit the path with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. Guests were already milling about near the archway, laughing politely and sipping champagne, most of them looking like magazine covers for people who pronounce hors d'oeuvres correctly and never admit to crying in the shower. The moment I stepped into view, the atmosphere shifted, heads turned, mouths paused mid-sip, conversations died mid-sentence. A few older men straightened their postures instinctively, recognizing the uniform before they recognized me. I didn't rush. I walked slowly, deliberately, like I had done so many times before in front of commanding officers and at memorials, aware of every step, every pair of eyes. The air was thick with unspoken questions and suppressed opinions. Some looked confused, some curious, and a few, a very few, stood up straighter in their chairs. One man, a World War II veteran I remembered from a past Christmas visit to the Monroe family church, actually rose from his seat and saluted me. I nodded back, just slightly, enough to acknowledge him without turning the moment into spectacle. I took my seat, third row, again, intentionally placed, no doubt, and crossed my legs as I rested my hat in my lap. Clare was still in the bridal suite, oblivious to the ripple effect my arrival had caused, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. I glanced around at the other guests. Our mother, sitting with Uncle Ted in the front row, had gone pale. She clutched her pearl necklace like a lifeline, her eyes darting between me and the entrance like she was waiting for someone to escort me out before things got ruined. Uncle Ted looked like he'd swallowed a fly, but neither of them moved. It wasn't long before Clare appeared at the top of the aisle, veiled and glowing, all eyes turning to her like she was royalty. But the moment her gaze landed on me, her face faltered. Just for a second, a hairline crack in her performance. Her mouth tightened, and she blinked too slowly, like her brain was trying to reboot the narrative she'd been constructing. I smiled at her. Not broadly, just enough for her to know I had seen her flinch. And then I looked away. See, the beauty of wearing a uniform is that it says everything for you without you having to raise your voice. It tells people who you are, what you've done, what you've sacrificed. It commands a room without demanding it. And on that day, it reminded every single person there that while Clare was busy trying to curate a life worthy of Instagram, I had lived one worthy of history. The ceremony began. The pastor cleared his throat and started speaking, but I wasn't listening. I was watching Clare, and she was watching me, and between us hung 15 years of rivalry, resentment, and unspoken grievances, wrapped in lace and military blues. She thought she'd taken my voice. She thought the scandal had buried me. But what she didn't understand, and what she was just beginning to realize as she walked stiffly down the aisle, was that sometimes the best revenge is not shouting back. Sometimes it's simply showing up, standing tall, and letting the truth speak for itself in every silent glance. And I hadn't even stood up yet. There's a certain electricity that charges the air when tension sits thick between people who refuse to acknowledge it. Like static before a lightning strike, or the slow intake of breath before a scream that never gets voiced. That was the exact sensation hanging over the ceremony as Clare made her way down the aisle, her steps slower than rehearsed, her smile brittle at the edges, and her eyes, well, her eyes refused to look anywhere near the third row, where I sat unmoving, silent, dressed not in defiance but in honor, though I knew to her it felt like sabotage. She had dreamed of this moment, practiced it to perfection, imagined every detail from the scent of her bouquet to the delicate lace trailing behind her like royalty. But what she hadn't accounted for was a living, breathing contradiction to her curated life, sitting right there for everyone to see, and worse, applaud. As the pastor welcomed the guests and began the opening remarks, his voice solemn and soft, there was a moment, just a flicker of time, where the room held its collective breath. Then from the second row, someone coughed. Sharp, intentional, not sick, but signaling. It was an older man I didn't recognize, though the tilt of his shoulders and the way his eyes held mine told me enough. He stood up, no hesitation, no apology. He rose, turned fully to face me, and with the slow, dignified motion of someone who had worn the same kind of uniform in his time, he brought his right hand to his temple and saluted. It happened quickly, yet with a weight that made time feel suspended. A few heads turned toward him, confused, and then more eyes found me. I didn't move, didn't acknowledge the man with more than a subtle incline of my head, but my presence had clearly snapped the ceremony's rhythm. Someone in the back, a younger man in his 30s maybe, wearing a navy pin on his lapel, followed suit. He rose and saluted too. Then, astonishingly, a woman, possibly an Air Force vet based on her demeanor and posture, stood from the far side and clapped once, slowly, deliberately, until it caught like wildfire through the room. Within seconds, what was meant to be the hushed reverence of a bride's grand entrance turned into a scattered but unmistakable standing ovation. Not for her, not for love, but for me. And I didn't smile. I sat there, hands on my lap, eyes forward, letting it all unfold around me. The clapping wasn't thunderous. This wasn't a stadium. But it was enough to be awkward. Enough to disrupt the fantasy Clare had been spinning for the better part of a year. Her perfect wedding, with its carefully curated guest list and 5-tier cake and pastel floral arrangements hand-selected for their Instagram appeal, was now cracking at the seams under the pressure of real-life consequences and unanticipated truths. Clare froze mid-aisle, her hands clutching her bouquet so tightly the flowers bent unnaturally. Her eyes, sharp and wide now, met mine across the room, and I saw fury there. Not the petty kind, not the childish kind, but the kind that simmers beneath years of unresolved inferiority and comparison and bitterness so old it becomes part of your DNA. The pastor, clearly unprepared for this detour from the script, cleared his throat again and said, with a weak attempt at humor, "Well, that's quite the welcome." Some guests chuckled, others shifted uncomfortably, and slowly, one by one, the applause died down and people resumed their seats. But the damage had been done. The illusion had cracked. And nothing Clare did from that point forward could paste it back together. She walked the rest of the aisle with forced grace, like a beauty queen finishing a routine with her heel broken and blood in her shoe, trying to smile through clenched teeth while the crowd now looked at her and wondered what they were missing. Because that's the thing about public spectacle. It doesn't just expose the obvious. It makes people question what's been hidden. Mark, standing nervously at the altar, looked between her and me with an expression that could only be described as trapped discomfort. The kind of look men wear when they suddenly realize they're stepping into a family drama far more complex than they understood. He gave her a weak smile, probably trying to be supportive, but Clare didn't return it. Her energy was now focused entirely on me, like she was trying to stare me out of existence, as though by sheer will she could erase what I represented. Truth, consequence, and worst of all, attention she couldn't control. As they began the vows, I stayed still. I didn't fidget, didn't break eye contact. I wanted her to feel the weight of everything she had tried to bury rising to the surface. I wanted her to know that no amount of curated beauty or passive-aggressive comments could cover up the fact that when she left me to drown during the worst moment of my life, I survived anyway and came back standing taller than before. Somewhere in the middle of Mark's vows, Clare's hand trembled. Just once, a flicker, but enough that she dropped one of the smaller flowers from her bouquet. She quickly stepped over it, but I saw it land, a broken stem, a white petal crushed beneath her heel. It felt symbolic, because here's the truth. There's no power in pretending to be pure. The real power lies in showing up, flaws and all, wearing every scar like armor, and daring the world to look away. And by the end of that ceremony, no one was looking away. Not anymore. There's a peculiar kind of silence that descends after a public disruption, one that doesn't soothe or restore, but instead hums with the unsaid, thick with judgment and confusion, like the heavy, expectant pause between thunderclaps in the middle of a storm. That's the silence that settled over the reception hall after the ceremony, not the warm hush of celebration, but the awkward, stifled quiet of people who had witnessed something they didn't quite understand, something that had made them shift uncomfortably in their designer shoes while reaching for explanations that weren't printed in the program. And at the center of that silence was Clare, visibly rattled, navigating the ballroom with the precision of a woman trying to contain a fire in a house made of paper walls, all while maintaining the illusion that nothing was burning at all. She floated between tables with that stiff-lipped smile she always wore when she felt control slipping, nodding to relatives, posing for photos, offering tight hugs to guests who congratulated her, while clearly glancing sideways at me, seated alone at the back near the bar, sipping on a neat whiskey that burned just enough to keep my hands from shaking. I didn't belong there, not according to her vision, not according to the family who had long ago decided that silence was more comfortable than standing beside someone who had dared to shout truth into a system designed to crush the voice of anyone who stepped out of line. And yet, there I sat, very much present, very much impossible to ignore, a ghost of every buried grievance they had hoped to silence with time, etiquette, and selective memory. It's a funny thing, public disgrace. It follows you like a second skin, clinging tighter the more you try to scrub it away, and eventually it becomes easier to wear it proudly than to keep pretending you're still someone you no longer recognize. For years, the story people knew about me was the version Clare preferred, the one where I had embarrassed the army, caused a scandal, made a mess too large to clean up without dragging the family name through the mud. But no one at that wedding, aside from me, knew the full weight of what had happened, because no one had ever asked. Not Mom, not Uncle Ted, not even Clare when the storm first broke and reporters swarmed our childhood street, hungry for quotes and faces to splash across the morning news. It started with a name, just one, a soldier under my command who came to me in private, trembling, ashamed, and scared. He told me what had been happening, how his superior officer had been abusing his position, harassing, threatening, and covering it all up under a chain of silence that stretched all the way up the command ladder. I did what I was supposed to do. I filed reports, I made calls, I followed protocol until the protocol became a dead end. And when I realized no one wanted it to go further, that they were counting on my fear, on my loyalty to the institution, I broke the chain. I took it outside, I went to the press, and that's when my life stopped being mine. Overnight, I was no longer Major Rachel Monroe, the officer with 17 years of service and 2 Bronze Stars. I became a traitor, a liability, the face of a controversy that the Department of Defense wanted buried deep under layers of bureaucracy and forgotten headlines. They didn't discharge me outright at first. They made me sit through hearings, dragged my name through mud, painted me as hysterical, bitter, insubordinate. They said I had personal motives, that I was disgruntled, that I had misunderstood the chain of command. In the end, they pushed me out not with a bang, but with a slow grinding erosion of every honor I had earned. And through it all, Clare never called, not once. So as I sat at her wedding, sipping my drink beneath the soft glow of string lights and chandeliers, I didn't feel shame. I felt grief not for the reputation I had lost, but for the family I realized had never known me to begin with. Across the room, I saw her glance toward me again, her smile faltering as our eyes met. She looked away quickly, turning back to one of her bridesmaids with a forced laugh, but her discomfort clung to her like sweat. At some point during the dinner, Uncle Ted approached, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his ill-fitting suit, that familiar look of familial duty souring his face. He didn't sit, just stood awkwardly beside me, as though afraid the proximity might somehow ruin his reputation by association. "You know, Rachel," he said slowly, picking his words like they were landmines, "maybe today wasn't the best day to make a statement." I turned my head toward him, locking eyes with a man who once held me as a child, who had given a toast at my army commissioning ceremony, who had promised to always be proud of me, no matter what. "I didn't come to make a statement," I said, my voice low and steady. "I came because I was invited, and I wore the most honest thing I own." He didn't respond right away, just stared at me, at the ribbons on my chest, the scars on my hands, the life written in folds and medals. Finally, he nodded, just once, a gesture that said more about shame than agreement, and walked away. I didn't follow. Later that night, as the music swelled and guests finally started dancing, Clare made her way to me, each step deliberate, her heels clicking like accusations against the hardwood floor. She stood in front of me, veil gone, hair slightly wilted from hours of pretending, and for the first time that day, she didn't smile. "You had to do it, didn't you?" she asked quietly, no venom in her tone, just exhaustion or maybe resignation. "I wore what I've earned," I replied, lifting my glass toward her like a toast. "That's more than I can say for some people here." She said nothing, just stared at me for a long moment, her eyes scanning my face like she was looking for the sister she once knew, and couldn't find her in the woman who'd replaced her. And maybe she was right. Maybe that woman didn't exist anymore, or maybe she never did. The end of the reception always arrives not with a bang or a toast, or even the final chorus of a well-worn pop song, but with a quiet fading of energy, an almost imperceptible unraveling of the facade, where the smiles begin to wilt. The makeup fades just enough to reveal real skin beneath the powder, and the people who were pretending to have a good time start looking for excuses to disappear. That's exactly how it felt in that moment, sitting in the back corner of the reception hall, half-drunk guests dragging their heels toward the bar or the bathroom, a few already sneaking out under the guise of checking on the babysitter, and Clare, my sister, the bride, the woman who once begged me to braid her hair the night before her 6th grade graduation. Standing near the DJ booth, waving off another request for a father-daughter dance she never wanted, because it reminded her too much of what we didn't have anymore. She wasn't celebrating, she was surviving. I suppose we both were. I had made it through the ceremony without interruption, through the dinner without confrontation, through the awkward glances and whispered side conversations about what she's doing here and why she had to wear that. But I hadn't come to sit quietly through humiliation, hadn't flown across the country just to sip watered-down whiskey and pretend like the story she told the world about me was the only version that mattered. No, I came because I needed to remind her, and maybe even myself, that silence was not the same thing as dignity, that forgiveness isn't owed, and that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried no matter how many flower arrangements you pile on top of it. I stepped outside, needing air that hadn't been recirculated through the mouths of gossipers and backstabbers, and lit a cigarette I had told myself I didn't want. The night was cool, the stars distant, as though even the sky didn't want to bear witness to the unraveling of a day that had been more months in the making. I was halfway through my smoke when I heard the door open behind me and the unmistakable sound of Claire's heels against the patio stones. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, arms crossed, her white dress slightly stained at the hem from where someone had spilled wine earlier. "I thought you were gone," she said eventually, her voice quieter than I had expected, lacking the venom she'd coated every word with in the weeks leading up to this day. "I was thinking about it," I replied without turning. But then I figured it would be rude to leave before the truth showed up. She let out a soft, bitter laugh, the kind people use when they're angry and exhausted in equal measure. "You came here to punish me." I took one final drag and exhaled slowly before answering. "No, I came here because you invited me. But the second you opened your mouth at that rehearsal dinner, I realized you weren't inviting your sister. You were inviting the version of me you thought you could humiliate. So I gave you someone else." Claire turned to face me then, her expression no longer angry, but brittle and exposed, like someone holding a secret they've carried for far too long. "You don't know what it was like," she said, her voice trembling now. "You were on the news, you were in the papers. Everyone was talking about you, my coworkers, my clients, even my damn yoga instructor. You think I didn't support you? But do you even know what it was like being your sister when that story broke?" I finally turned to meet her eyes, and in them I saw something unexpected. Not guilt, not arrogance, but fear. Fear that her carefully built world had been threatened by someone she couldn't control. "You think that was hard?" I said, my voice sharper now, more precise. "You think it was hard hearing people gossip about me in your office? I was the one they put under investigation. I was the one who lost my rank, who got death threats, who couldn't walk down the damn street without someone spitting the word traitor under their breath. And through all of that, not once did you call. Not to ask if I was okay. Not to tell me you believed me. Not even to lie." Claire looked away, her hands tightening around her elbows, like she was holding herself together with the last thread of control she had. "I didn't leak the story," she said quietly, almost too softly for me to hear. "But I knew who did. One of Mark's old college friends was a reporter. He was digging, and I gave him enough to find the rest." There it was, the confession. She hadn't pushed me off the cliff, but she'd handed someone the map to the edge. I let the silence hang between us, heavy and sour, because there was nothing I could say that would make it more real than it already was. She had sold me out, not for money, not even for fame, but for peace. She had chosen comfort over loyalty, reputation over family. I should have screamed. I should have thrown something, cried, done anything that might have made the weight in my chest feel lighter, but I didn't. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the invitation, folded it carefully down the middle, and handed it back to her. I didn't crash your wedding, I said, my voice quiet and final. You crashed my life. The least you could do was give me a seat. She didn't reach for the paper. She just stared at it, frozen, as I dropped it at her feet. When I walked away, I didn't look back. Not at her, not at the guests inside who were pretending the evening hadn't gone completely sideways, not even at the building itself. I just walked, my heels echoing against the stone path like a drumbeat, each step louder than the last. The wedding went on, I heard later. The cake was cut, the music resumed. People danced and drank and made polite conversation like nothing had happened. But it had, and everyone who was there knew it, even if they didn't have the word to name it. As for Clare, she got her pictures, her hashtags, her wedding album filled with smiling faces that would never tell the whole story. But I got something else. I got to tell mine. And the truth, whether anyone was ready for it or not, got the standing ovation it always deserved.